Good afternoon. I think we have the okay to get started. I'm Becca Hendricks. I'm with the National Pork Board. My role is Assistant Vice President of International Marketing. And here in a little bit, I'm going to introduce the main part of our seminar today, the interesting part. First of all, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about international marketing and how U.S. pork exports fit into the global market. So just to start out, a little bit of background on why we export product. It's a big world. We all know that 96% of the world's population is outside of the U.S., and pork is the #1 global consumed animal protein. And currently the EU and the U.S. compete for being the largest global exporter. China is the largest producer, but these two countries compete as far as exporting. And currently, 26% of the U.S. pork and pork variety meat production is exported. And I'm going to talk about a little bit what products we export, because a lot of this product that is shipped overseas is the products that we don't eat here in the U.S. So looking at what we export, you probably can't read this very well, but for instance, 7% of the bellies produced in the U.S. are exported, but 40% of the hams are exported, 65% of the picnics are exported. So kind of a range depending on price and the market on what is shipped overseas. But when we look at variety meats, these are a lot of the products that our typical consumers not eating, is not a regular part of the diet, but is a part of traditional cuisine in other markets. So about 90% of all of the edible variety meats and byproducts that are produced in the U.S. are exported. So where do we export? Last year we exported to over 100 countries around the world. Our exports last year were the third year in a row that we exceeded $6 billion in exported products. So it was a record year for 3 years in a row. But you can see that last year we were down 4% in value and 5% in volume compared to 2013. And there's many reasons for this. I'm just going to highlight a few for background. There was high supplies in importing countries, so some of the Asian countries had higher domestic supplies, so our product wasn't as competitive. Also, trade access and trade barriers. Dermot's going to touch on this a little bit more. Strong competition with our other exporting competitors, with the EU, with Canada, with Chile, and also a strong dollar. So when our currency is higher, then we're less competitive globally. When we look at this year, this is a list of our top markets for this year. Q1, we had exports up 11% in value and in volume, and in March up 29%. And Mexico has traditionally, or for a long time, been our #1 volume customer, and Japan our #1 value customer. And really looking into, you're probably wondering, with such high, record high pork prices, why exports were up for the first quarter. The value is now over $63 per head. So each animal, the value of that carcass is up, or that animal is up, is $69, is attributed to exports. And right now it's at about 31.5% of our production. So some of the reason that this is, that we had such a successful first quarter was because as prices have gone up, they're also going up in importing countries, which Dermot will also touch on. And also they know that prices are going to go up even more as the year goes on, as supplies go down. So they're buying up and stocking up in anticipation of even higher prices. So I wanted to real quick touch on how our industry, how the pork industry works on pork producers' behalf for exporting about 25% of our product. The National Pork Board, which is what I'm with, so that's the checkoff dollars that go into marketing, research, promotion, education. the National Pork Producers Council, who does legislative, regulatory, trade access issues, works on trade negotiations around the world. And then the U.S. Meat Export Federation is sort of our marketing promotion arm around the world. And then also work closely with the state pork, soy, and corn associations who fund a lot of these activities also. And then I'm going to wrap up and turn it over to Dermot, but thought I would set it up with this slide showing that how exports have increased over time based on our trade access. So those organizations that are all working together, we work to get a market open, and then we work to promote the product and educate importers, and then to try and keep the market open. So you can see over time how our increase in free trade agreements, we now have 16 internationally in place, how as we get access, we're able to export more product. So with that, I'm going to quickly read Dermot's bio. Sorry. So Dermot Hayes is the Pioneer Hybrid International Chair in Agribusiness, Professor of Economics, and Professor of Finance at Iowa State University. He's the co-director of the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute at Iowa State. He has distinguished himself with many awards at the college and university levels for his work as a teacher and researcher. In 2006, he received a Publication of Enduring Quality Award for the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association. They named him a fellow in 2007, which is its highest recognition for distinction in the discipline. Besides his analysis of U.S. foreign policy, international agriculture trade, his other research interests include food safety, livestock modeling, demand analysis, and commodity markets. And since 1995, he's been doing a lot of consulting for both the National Pork Board and National Pork Producers Council. And for me personally, has been a great mentor and teacher in our effort. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dermot.
Thank you, Becca. About 3 weeks ago, I was in Omaha with Jim McKean, who has since passed away. He was a good friend of mine at Iowa State. He was in the vet college and swine extension, and his job was to introduce me, and he got to my bio, which I did not write, and he looked at it and read it, and then he threw it away, and he said, it looks like his mother wrote that. So, my real job at Iowa State is to teach the incoming ag business freshmen, and then I am also the last teacher they get if they're interested in futures and options. It's a very rewarding job, and one of the first things I do is to try and explain the benefits of trade. I do two things. One, I arrange that one of the students who already owns the textbook on day one buys a second or wins a second copy of the textbook. So now this student has two copies. And then I get another student who hasn't yet bought the textbook. Textbook sells for $100. And so we got one student with two textbooks and one student with zero. And if there's no trade, then one student has too many and the other student has a scarcity. And they trade. I let them trade, and typically it changes hands for about $50. Now, the key there is just allowing trade to occur between an area of surplus, the person with two, and an area of scarcity, the person with one, instantaneously creates $100 worth of wealth in the classroom. Because one student has something that's worth nothing, they get $50 for it. The other student was going to have to spend $100, and they get it for less. They get it for $50 less. So trade creates wealth wherever it goes, and that's the key. And that's one of the examples we begin with, and how people who trade with each other and move product from surplus areas to scarcity areas create wealth for everybody, and both sides benefit. I'm going to give you another example on the importance of trade, then I'll show you a different alternative of the export data that Becca described, showing you the actual quantities going to each country and how they rank. Talk about some ongoing trends in some of our key customers, and why I'm very optimistic long run about export opportunities. I'll show you some slides about China in particular. 5 years ago, I spoke at this meeting, and I talked about the potential in China. It's actually happening right now. as we'll see. And then, as Becca mentioned, I do consult with the national pork producers on trade agreements. I crunch the numbers for them, and I'll talk about what's going on with 2 huge trade agreements that are out there. That one with the Pacific Rim countries, Japan, Vietnam, potentially Taiwan, South Korea, and China, and the other with Europe. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll be informal here today. Okay, this is a second example I use to get people interested in trade. As most of you know, Iowa produces a huge quantity of corn and soybeans and meat. Now pretend that we closed our borders. Iowa shut down its borders, as Argentina has done, and said, Iowa food is for Iowa people. We're going to produce all the food we want here. We're not going to import any food, and we're not going to export any food. Right? Now, life would be a bit odd. First of all, we'd have a surplus of corn and soybeans, and so people would quit farming. But we'd have a scarcity of things like bananas and cotton and coffee. And so the people who quit farming would probably work in glass houses and become involved in labor-intensive products. Life would be odd, but we could do it. At least we could. It would be boring, but we could live pretty well. The main part of the meal would be fine. It's just the extra bits that would be a little bit pricey. Now, then, let 100 years pass. So now you've gotten the Union of Cotton Pickers of Des Moines and coffee pickers, and that's their job. That's all they know. They don't realize that there's a farm up in Kasuth County with good land that can be used, because they don't. It's been 100 years since that was farmed. And then the job of the trade economists, or my job, is to convince people that they should actually open the borders to trade. But by now, their job is to pick cotton or coffee, and they've forgotten that they could be running a huge John Deere tractor over 2,000 acres, and they don't want it. And they tell their legislature they don't want it. And they're right, because they have a good job picking coffee. They're not getting paid a lot because it's labor intensive, but they're afraid of change. And so I think the job of economists is to come along and make examples like this and say, hey, we're all better off with trade. It really does improve everybody's benefit. Everybody comes out ahead if we trade and trade with other countries. And that's why I'm so passionate about it, and why I enjoy working with the Pork Board and with the NPPC. One last example. You don't need economists if you know a little bit about geography or history. The countries on the left are all free trading countries, and the countries on the right are closed. And just ask yourself where you prefer to live. It's just so obvious to me. Now, there's one country in the world that really believes it, and that's Singapore, and it does everything with free trade. The U.S. is not perfect. I mean, we have barriers on imports, and we have. But Singapore, if you want to export something there, it goes in without restriction. And that country is now 20% wealthier than the U.S. on a per capita basis. And it has no natural resources. It even imports the water that it uses. And that's the kind of wealth that can be created if we could just listen and do what we do well and export what we have in surplus and import what we need. Okay. I'm going to show you a lot of numbers, but Becca showed you the big picture. This is annual performance for U.S. pork exports. And this is all pork exports, both muscle meat and variety meats. And as Becca mentioned, they've been relatively stable for 3 years, down a little bit between 2012 and 2013, primarily because we completely lost the Russian market. Russia has been a tough partner for many, many years. It desperately needs to import meat, but its government just doesn't want it to happen, and it keeps finding new excuses to keep a U.S. product. In addition to that, this time, or in March of 2013, we almost lost the Chinese market. They started to test for a product that is legal here, and that scared a lot of people, and a product that would have moved to China did not move. And so in the first quarter of 2013, our export markets were really, really miserable, quite the opposite of what they look like this year. So that trouble in China and trouble in Russia, and on top of that, Mexico was in the process of killing its sows as a response to the drought. And so in the first quarter of last year, exports were down and prices were down. So we recovered, and we only fell by 4.62%, which is relatively stable and is a little bit over 2 million tons. And if you think of a 20 or 40 ton shipping container, that's a lot of containers. At the end of the year, Mexico was up, and this is tons. And as I said 5 years ago, I talked about the potential in China. Now our second market in quantity terms is actually China, Hong Kong. Japan is our third market in quantity. And then I'll talk a little bit more about Canada and why we lost some share there. A lot of it happened at the end of the year. Korea had foot-and-mouth disease in 2010 and 11. We had a surge of exports into Korea. Then they recovered from the disease. They put sows back into clean barns that had been empty for 6 months. They had a huge surge in productivity, and then our exports to Korea last year were down because they were replacing our product with their own. And then, just for those of you who've been paying attention to trade, look at all these countries that we haven't talked about in the past. Places like Colombia, Chile, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Panama, Guatemala, and Peru. They're all in now top volume markets, and they're growing very, very rapidly. Colombia up 76% last year. Now, that's not a coincidence. We have a free trade agreement with Colombia. It's an aggressive agreement, and as it's being phased in, we're essentially creating a new market for our products there. We also have a free trade agreement with South Korea, and I would expect the same to start to happen. We have a free trade agreement with South America, so the reason that you see places like Dominican Republic, Panama, Guatemala, and Peru is because we have free trade agreements, and our exports to those countries is surging. Enough, in fact, to compensate for the loss of a huge market in Russia and for 1/4 losses in Mexico and China. I'll quickly show you the value market, and everything is the same as before, except this is dollars, and Japan is still our #1 value market, and that's because Japan will not allow us to export anything except expensive pork cuts. So by definition, the product we ship to Japan are the high value cuts. Otherwise, the patterns are the same. Okay, first, now just to try and put that in perspective, depending on the year, depending on how you measure it, we export about 1/4 of the pork we produce. That means in some way the industry is about 1/4 bigger than it would otherwise be. So 1/4 of the barns that are out there in some way are related to export, 20% to 25%. And for those of you from Iowa, at the moment, Iowa produces about 1/3 of the slaughter hogs in the U.S. So as Becca mentioned, we export more than $6 billion, which means coming out of Iowa is approximately $2 billion worth of pork exports. Divide that by Iowa's population, and you get an incredible economic contribution of pork exports to this state. And I don't think most people realize quite how important it has become. And we see it in hog prices too. We see it when we have a new market in Korea because they have a disease. We see a surge in prices. And March of 2013, we saw hog prices collapse because we lost export markets. It really matters when these people are buying and they add value. Now, lastly, I'll show you what first quarter looks like. Everything looks good. We got exports are up over 10%. Mexico, they're buying a lot of frozen hams. Japan is up for the first time in many, many years. They're stockpiling frozen pork too. China, Hong Kong is up. Canada is down. Now this Canada thing, we have trade going two ways with Canada. We tend to import feeder pigs from them, and then we export pork back into Eastern Canada. About 1/3 of the retail pork sold in Canada is fattened in the U.S. Well, recently we've restricted the flow of Canadian feeder pigs coming in here with what is really a protectionist move on our behalf. It's called country of origin labeling, but it's hard for the Canadians to find a market for their feeder pigs, and so they're keeping them, and so they have more pork of their own, and they're buying less of ours. For the first time since the recovery of the foot-and-mouth disease, South Korea is back up, and I would expect it to continue to be. In 2016, the U.S. will have complete access for frozen pork in Korea, and in 2018, we'll have complete access for chilled pork. So that becomes a new Colombia for us. Australia, again, look at what's happening in Colombia because of the free trade agreement. and then you see those other countries all growing too, the ones that I mentioned. The Ukraine is a little bit funny because when we were out of Russia, we suddenly saw a lot of pork going into the Ukraine, and that's just because it was being somehow transshipped from Ukraine into Russia. And I suppose that will continue if there's not a war there. Okay, what's going to happen this year? Well, as you know, we've lost, 7-8 million pigs because of PED. Now, to compensate, we're adding a lot of weight. We're seeing many pigs over 300 pounds. So the impact on total pork production is not equal to the proportion of live animals that have died. But it's somewhere in the range of 4% to 6% taken over a year. Well, a simplistic version of trade would say, well, the U.S. is going to produce 5% less pork. So we'll take all of that 5% away from the export market, and we'll keep U.S. consumption constant. That's not how it works at all. It's not like we dump all of our surplus pork on the export market and then stop exporting when we don't have so much. It's much more sophisticated and complex than that. And it's a challenge to figure out exactly what PED is going to do to our exports. As Becca mentioned, a lot of countries have the problem that we have, and if Japan, Mexico, Korea, and Canada, and Colombia they have PED, and if we did not, then they would make up their scarcity by buying our product. So we actually have an attempt by several countries to buy more of our product. The trouble is we don't have much, so prices are in the range of 120 or per 100 pounds. Adding further to complexity, the Russians, which have been really hard for us to deal with, recently stopped buying pork from Europe. Europe used to export almost 1 million tons of pork into Russia. The reason the Russian gave is incredibly annoying, because they said, what happened was Russia has a disease called African swine fever. It's endemic in Russia. It's killing a lot of its pigs. A few wild animals from Russia got into Lithuania. These were Russian animals. Now, according to the Russians, the European Union has African swine fever, so they won't buy any pork from Europe. So that's a 1 million ton market that Europe lost, and Europe has to find a new place for that. The good news for us is they're so scarce on pork in Europe that we're now back in the market. So this year we should see an expansion of U.S. pork, but it's tough on the Europeans, and that pork is going to be out there somewhere, and that's adding complexity to this. But as Becca also mentioned, some of the product that we export, let's say hind feed, it's not like the U.S. customer is going to buy a lot of hind feed, so those products will always be exported or rendered. And what will happen this year is we'll render less and export more. So my bottom line, U.S. pork consumption by domestic consumers will fall by 4 to 6%, and exports will fall about the same, by 4 to 6%, with each group absorbing the PED impact in a similar fashion. I don't think that exports are going to make up all of the PED losses. It'll be borne proportionally by the U.S. and by our international customers. I'd appreciate your opinion on that. A lot of you thought through this too, so this is just a guess. Okay, looking beyond PEDv, if you ask yourself how big the Arizona pork industry is, it's not that big, right? And that's kind of the same economics are at play between us and Mexico. It's just cheaper to ship Midwestern pork into price-conscious Mexican consumers than it is to ship corn and soybeans down with which for them to produce pork. So Mexico, we have free trade agreement with them, and we're just going to continue to expand our exports. That expansion will go to allowing Mexicans to eat more pork. Their domestic industry production has been relatively flat because that sells fresh pork into a high-end sector. Japan will be tough. It's an aging population. Their government is heavily subsidizing their pork industry, so they're actually increasing pork production in Japan. And Japan has signed free trade agreements with Mexico and Chile, so they're taking market share away from us. Now, at the end of my talk, I'll mention that we have an ongoing free trade agreement with Japan, and so if we get a good free trade agreement with Japan, we're going to have a huge market there. But if in the absence of that, we're going to continue to lose market share. I see unbelievable potential in China and Hong Kong, so much so that I'm going to show you some data and some slides that I hope will make my point. And then, as I said, mandatory country of origin labeling. I think it's not a free. It's an attempt by us to keep Canadian product out. It's working, but it's also reducing our exports to Canada. South Korea. That was a huge market in 2011. Then we lost it. There's a lesson there, and that is that their outbreak came back with a pork producer who had visited a foot-and-mouth infected country in Vietnam. And the pork producer apparently had bought some meat and fed it to pigs in Korea. And so for those of you who are pork producers and who travel, please, if you bring product back, don't feed it to your pigs. And it's incredibly easy to spread foot-and-mouth disease. It's been in Korea, it's been in Japan, it's been in Taiwan, it's been in Ireland and in England. They're all island nations, and yet they got that disease. So be careful, because it moves faster than anybody could realize. And we don't want to wake up one day and find out we have that disease, and then trying to figure out what we're going to do with 25% of our product that would otherwise have left the country. We do have a free trade agreement with Australia. Our exports surged there. The Australian industry is fighting back. It's got a promotional campaign that effectively criticizes U.S. pork and, of course, enhances Australian pork. They voluntarily took their sows out of stalls, and they voluntarily stopped using ractopamine. So now they're turning around and saying that U.S. pork is from animals that are abused because they're in stalls and fed hormones. So we've got an issue there. Their pork producers have convinced the two top retailers to boycott U.S. product. We had some very good news in New Zealand. We have a free trade agreement. We got complete access. There's some issues right now because we were supposed to get access with primals going in, and then they were supposed to be cut into 3 kilogram retail ready pieces inside of New Zealand. Our own government interpreted it differently and said you can only export 3 kilogram retail ready pieces to New Zealand. So we got to resolve that somehow. And then, as I said, Colombia is just a textbook. These are Spanish people who live in Colombia are from Spain. They're naturally pork eaters. They just didn't have pork because they didn't have a way of producing a lot. So they were eating about 4 kilograms per person, even though they wanted more. And suddenly they're getting access to chilled U.S. pork. They're increasing their consumption. Their own industry should maintain its production for just as Mexico did. So it's that textbook case. So just like the two students who exchanged the textbook in my example, they're benefiting with cheaper pork, and we're benefiting from exports. And that's true throughout Central America and with a range of countries that you never heard of that are now in our top 20 export markets. Okay. My next bullet point is why I'm optimistic long run about pork exports. I belong to a benchmarking group. It's not comparing production costs within the U.S., it's comparing production costs across the U.S. The first couple of years I belonged, I actually used Iowa State's production cost numbers, whereas my colleagues in other countries were using production costs for the very best producers. But even so, what this slide says is that the U.S., which is on the left, has the second lowest production cost in the world. The only place that's lower than us is Mato Grosso in Brazil, but they can't get pork out of Mato Grosso because it's 1,000 miles away from an ocean, and there's no good rail line to get the product out. So the countries that are truly can put product onto the market, we are the low-cost producer. And that's even using Iowa State's numbers, which I think most of you would agree are a little bit too high. So that's number one, where we've got a very productive system. Two, pork, if you think about it, is a land-intensive product because it uses corn and soybeans require a lot of land. If you want to grow an acre of soybeans, your biggest input by far is the acre of land you use. And so the most land-intensive product in the world is soybeans, and corn is close, and pork is a combination of the two. And so countries that have a lot of land, as we do, will export land-intensive products. And these are the crop acres per person in different parts of the world. China feeds 5 people from every acre. That's amazing. A lot of you have quarter-acre lots if you live in a town. Can you imagine feeding yourself on that? Well, that's what China has managed to do. You can see that Iowa and Minnesota, we have a lot of land, and under free trade, we'll export that product, and that product is corn and soybeans and the derivatives, eggs, pork, beef, chicken, etc. Lastly, China in February of this year announced that it was going to free up its corn markets. It had a quota of 7.5 million on imported corn. So it buys a lot of DDGS, it buys 70 million tons of soybeans, but it restricted its corn imports, and it now has announced its intention to stop doing that. Why? Because it was taking $10, $12 a bushel to get Chinese farmers to grow corn, and they can't, their consumers don't want to eat pork produced with $12 corn when they can buy pork produced with $4 and $5 corn from us. And so China has changed its policy, and what I expect will happen is that China will now follow what other Asian countries have done and stop producing feed grains, or at least greatly reduce their corn and soybean production and import instead. And that's exactly what happened, and this slide shows that in South Korea and Japan, when they opened their corn markets, they stopped producing corn because they have better uses for their land than producing a land-intensive product. South Korea, other than rice, it's all what we would consider labor-intensive products like garlic, ginseng, glass houses, fruit trees, etc. That's what you do when land is scarce. You grow labor-intensive products and make the maximum use of your small farm. The other thing that is important is that if markets were allowed to work completely, then we would only export the final product. This graph shows self-sufficiency ratios in countries that have some exposure to free trade over time. So you've got 1991, 2011, and we have some kind of trade agreement with those countries. In the beginning of the period, they were buying their corn and soybeans and producing the pork, and now at the end of the period, they're buying about 40 to 50% of the pork internationally. And that's just simple transportation economics. It's far more efficient to move the final pieces of pork around than it is to ship corn and soybeans. And if you ever see a rail train with corn on it, you know there's a government distortion, because in the absence of that, you would be moving the final product. By the way, we ship corn to the southern part of the U.S. because Iowa will not allow a broiler industry in this state. So that's our distortion, not theirs. Okay, some slides on China. I'm personally fascinated with it. Well, it's now our number 2 volume market, so I guess it's appropriate. I mean, if you've seen me speak before, you've seen this slide. It's an overlay of the U.S. and China with the same lines of latitude and longitude. Amazingly similar coastline on the northeast in both countries, about the same size. And I'll ask you to look at the bulge in the bottom, because that's where the good land and the people are. That's that same bulge, that green area. You can see it to the west, except for Sichuan, which is there. Except for Sichuan, a lot of the rest of China is just uninhabitable. And so a lot of people, 1.2 to 1.3 billion people living in a relatively narrow area. And you see that with the population density. Just the density in that area, in those areas, which are also the agricultural areas, is the same density we have in, let's say, between Los Angeles and San Diego, or between Washington, D.C. and New York. And the rest of the country is uninhabited. And that's where the pigs are. That's where the people were. And that's 50 million sows in a small area. I mean, the U.S. in total has less than 6 million sows. And so there are some disease issues they've encountered. I know my colleagues at Iowa State have worked a lot to try and resolve those. But there's only so much you can do raising that many pigs in such a small space. And as a result, the productivity of sows in Asia has not been improving as it has in Europe or Canada or the U.S. The flat lines here are the pigs, essentially is the productivity of sows measured in tons of pork produced per sow in inventory per year. You can see they're flat. And then the blue line is the U.S., and that's what you'd expect. Every year, our sows produce about 3% more meat per animal, except this year because of PED. And in Asia, that trend has not been occurring because of the density issues, which I think are causing disease. The green line is Korea. You can see why we lost the market there last year, simply because they have never had such productive sows. And I guess the lesson there is, if you ever have a disease problem, clear out your barns for 6 months, and when you put the sows back in, they will be productive. And as I said, China is behaving just like other Asian countries. In 2012 and 2013, it actually spent more dollars on importing animal protein than on corn and soybeans, even though it's importing 70 million tons of soybeans. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but we get a little over a ton of soybeans per acre, right? 40 bushels, a national average. 70 million tons is like exporting 70 million acres. Now, Iowa only has 30 million, so that's huge import already for China for soybeans, but yet it's spending more on animal products. New Zealand, if you've been there, it's just booming because of all the milk that's going into China. I think we have the same opportunity. There is an important point, and Becca made it too. Tastes are just fundamentally different. This was a meal I was offered. I was delighted because I recognized almost everything. And for me, the thing on the top was just a decoration. I was with a very well-educated woman who had done an MBA in France. Her parents were in the Chinese military, very wealthy, very well-educated, and that's a delicacy. In China, they're bored with the big pieces of loins and tenderloins. They don't want those. They'll pay a premium. They'll pay more for chicken feet than for chicken breast, and they'll pay more for if you give them a fish. The best part is the head, and the person who is the most important person at the table gets to eat the fish head or the chicken head or whatever. And that if we can just take advantage of that, we could take the pieces of the animal that we're not fully utilizing now, sell them for a high price, and then reduce the cost of loins and tenderloins sold to the domestic U.S. consumer. It's a fundamentally different opportunity. With Japan, we're always competing for loins and tenderloins. With the U.S., with these markets, we have a different potential. We could actually split that carcass, add value to what the Europeans are starting to call the fifth quarter, and then reduce the break-even price of producing hams and loins for the U.S. And just to show you how huge that market is and why it's so fascinating, that blue line is pork production in China. Now, down here, you've got broiler production in the U.S. and pork production in the U.S. That red line is U.S. pork production. So compare the red line against the blue line. That compares the size of the U.S. pork industry with the size of the Chinese pork industry. Now, what China has done is, as people have asked for more pork, they've added more sows and produced the pork, but they're running into disease issues, and they also have announced these market liberalizations. And if they were to start buying, let's say, 5-10% of their pork on international markets, or even 40%, as we saw in other countries, then the potential for change in our industry is just phenomenal. How could we produce enough to satisfy 50% of the Chinese market unless we made major changes? And yet that's where the economics wants us to go. Okay. Right now, the U.S. has two unbelievably important negotiations going on. Looking across the Pacific, we're signing a free trade agreement with, importantly, Japan, a list of other countries, including Vietnam. And those negotiations are this close to being finalized. Actually, what's holding them up are negotiations over agriculture, over beef, dairy, and pork. And President Obama went over there, actually sat down with their Premier Abe, and they talked about pork. They're trying to get this thing resolved. The issue, of course, is that Japan wants to continue to protect this pork industry, so it wants to have a duty on imported pork, and it wants to use that duty to protect this pork industry, to actually give more subsidies to producers. And that isn't sitting well with the leadership of the U.S. pork industry, and so it's an incredible decision. I hope it turns out well. If it does, there's a phenomenal opportunity in exporting more pork to Japan. If it doesn't, Japan has simultaneous trading negotiations with both European Union and Canada. So the downside is we don't get a deal, and Japan can get pork from Canada and the European Union. So we lose market share. That's the worst case scenario. And the best case scenario is that we convince the Japanese that that free trade means free trade. It doesn't mean that the two students from earlier can trade textbooks as long as one student gets to keep 2 textbooks. That's the current Japanese line. And if that works out, it's just phenomenal. I mean, you've got 110 million wealthy people with production costs 2.5 or so times greater than us, and if we get free access, it's going to be a game changer. European Union. that these are much less further along. I think the Europeans are willing to give up import duties, but they're not willing to give up non-tariff barriers. Strangely enough, the Europeans still think that genetically modified corn and soybeans are potentially unsafe to human health. My daughter was there for spring break, and actually, Dale, your daughter was with her, and they were in a taxi, and the taxi driver said, "Is it true you pump your animals full of genetic GM?" I think he meant hormones, but. And then later on, he was telling my daughter that the best steak he ever had was in New York City. So there's a very strange attitude about pork over there and about our agriculture. And they appear to be intransigent about letting product in, such as genetically modified pork or pork fed ractopamine or beef fed with Ralgro and Phenoplex. And I don't know how we're going to get past that. I would argue that in the U.S. we have a choice. If you want to go to Whole Foods, you can get the product you want, pay a little bit more, and if you want a commodity product, you can buy that. In Europe, the activists over there have pretty well stopped people from accessing the kind of products that we buy here, and I hope that they get a choice, and if they do, the opportunities there are also phenomenal. We can get product into Europe at a price below their production costs, and that's even before their packing plants have gotten involved. And so, if it works, it'll be great. But the downside is, for me, the downside is the Europeans appear to be completely intransigent. And I will tell you that the reason that European consumers are so distrustful of technology is because their regulatory system has failed them. They've had thalidomide was an issue, a bad regulatory decision when I was a kid, and a lot of kids were born without any limbs, and they've had BSE and recently commingling of horse meat with beef, and Italian veal farmers were illegally using DES, which is a hormone, and it was getting into school lunches. I mean, they've had problems over there, and they've lost faith in technology, and they've moved away from science, and now they want to take that anti-technology and bring it into the negotiations, and that's a big concern.